A 17-year-old girl stayed home alone for a short time on a Friday morning. When her mother came home at noon, Jessica's car was parked in front of the house when it should have been at school. The driver's door was slightly open. Jessica's cell phone was on the seat. On the screen, the digits 9 and 1. She had tried to dial 911 and hadn't finished. Under the seat, one of her shoes, her keys, and in the back seat, her textbooks, her work clothes, her purse. Everything she needed to live her day left behind. What followed was a 15-year investigation defined by catastrophic failures, a truth hidden inside a family, and a detective who finally refused to let it stay buried. Jessica Dish was born on May 2, 1982, in Shepherdsville, Kentucky, a small, close-knit community where farming was a way of life and most people knew each other's names. She was the oldest of 3 children. Her 2 younger brothers depended on her in the way younger siblings depend on an older sister in a household where the parents work long hours. Jessica helped with the boys from an early age. She was reliable. Her parents trusted her completely. At 15, she got a part-time job at a local restaurant to save for something she had specifically decided she wanted, her own car, a red Pontiac. She saved methodically, and by the time she needed it, she had enough to make it happen. Alongside the job, she maintained strong grades. She was planning for college. She wanted to study accounting. She was, by every account, exactly the kind of teenager her community would describe as having everything ahead of her. In the fall of 1999, Jessica entered her senior year. She had recently started dating someone for the first time. She was 17 years old, and she was looking forward to what came next. The morning of September 10, 1999 began like any other in the Dish household. Jessica's parents left for work while she was still sleeping. Her younger brothers walked to the bus stop and headed to school. Jessica was supposed to drive herself to school in her Pontiac a little later. That was the arrangement for senior students who had their own transportation. Around noon, Jessica's mother returned home. She immediately noticed the Pontiac in the driveway. It should have been at school. Her first thought was that Jessica had overslept and missed her first classes. She went inside and checked her bedroom. Empty. She called Jessica's father at work, thinking maybe he had given Jessica a ride for some reason. He had not. He had left for work alone that morning. Her mother went back outside to check the car. She thought perhaps something was wrong with the engine. What she saw when she got close stopped her completely. The driver's door was not fully latched. It was standing open just enough to catch the eye. Jessica's cell phone was on the seat. On the screen, 9 and 1. Not a completed call. A call that had been started and interrupted. Under the seat, 1 shoe. The keys, and in the back seat, neatly placed as if for a normal school day, her textbooks, her work uniform, her purse. Nothing was scattered, nothing was violent in appearance, but nothing about it made sense either. Jessica would not have walked away from her car voluntarily and left everything she needed behind. They lived on the edge of town. Wherever she would go from that driveway on foot, she would have to walk miles along a road. Her mother called the school. Jessica had not been to class. The school had not notified the family. Jessica's best friend from the restaurant called that afternoon. Jessica had also not shown up for her shift. Her parents called the police. Before we continue, if you want cases like Jessica's told in full, with the failures named as clearly as the facts, subscribe to Unresolved Years Mysteries now. This is the kind of story this channel was built for. The response from local law enforcement was not what the circumstances called for. The sheriff suggested that Jessica had probably wandered off and would come back on her own. He pointed to no evidence of foul play and implied the family was concerned over nothing. He did not address the 9 and 1 on the phone screen. He did not address the single shoe left under the seat. He did not open an investigation. Jessica's parents pushed. They described the phone, the shoe, the fact that their 17-year-old daughter had left everything she owned in an unlocked car. They were sent home. The next morning, Jessica still had not returned. They went back to the sheriff's office. This time, 2 officers were sent to examine the car. They handled the vehicle without protective gloves, contaminating whatever the interior surfaces might have held. They did not examine Jessica's bedroom, which would have been standard procedure for a missing person. Jessica's parents had no choice but to build their own response. They reached out to family, to friends, to anyone who might have seen or heard anything. They contacted local news outlets. They printed flyers. Together with relatives, they began physically searching the town and its surroundings. The search was led by Jessica's father and his brother Stanley. They knew the local terrain well. Fearing the worst, they made their way toward a stretch of land near the river, an area known for being secluded and poorly maintained, historically associated with illegal activity. Hours of searching through difficult ground near the river produced nothing. On the 3rd morning after Jessica disappeared, something happened at the family home that no one expected. Jessica's younger brother was playing in the yard. He came running inside saying he had heard what sounded like his sister's voice crying out for help. His father grabbed a shotgun and went out immediately. At the same moment, his brother Stanley pulled up to the house. They were moving through the yard when someone noticed smoke rising from the neighboring property. The neighbor was a 40-year-old man named David Brooks. As they approached the boundary of his land, they could see him burning something that looked like clothing. Jessica's father asked Brooks for permission to search his property. Brooks refused and told them to leave. That refusal was not the only strange behavior Brooks had exhibited since Jessica vanished. Before her disappearance, the family had maintained a perfectly normal relationship with him. After she went missing, his behavior shifted. He began driving slowly past their house, staring at them. The family began receiving phone calls where the person on the other end said nothing and simply breathed. They suspected Brooks, though they couldn't explain why he would behave that way. Jessica's parents went back to the police. They described the burning clothing. They asked for cadaver dogs to be brought to Brooks's property. Officers came. Using Jessica's clothing to establish a scent, the dogs were brought onto Brooks's land. They tracked to the fire pit. No physical evidence was recovered there, but in one of the outbuildings, the dogs alerted to a smell consistent with decomposition. Inside the shed, officers found black gloves. Brooks remained calm throughout and was not detained. Jessica's father made a decision. He contacted the FBI directly. The Bureau generally does not open investigations based solely on family requests, but the combination of what he presented, the phone with 911, the single shoe, the burning clothing, the cadaver dog alert, the sheriff's consistent inaction, prompted them to get involved. What followed was the first serious investigative effort since Jessica disappeared. FBI agents processed Jessica's bedroom and her car properly, collecting fingerprints and any available physical evidence for laboratory analysis. They organized an aerial and ground search, deploying helicopters and coordinating volunteers to cover the surrounding area systematically. They examined the pond near the family home. They went back through Brooks's property. In one of Brooks's outbuildings, agents found something that shifted the investigation's focus sharply. A printed photograph of Jessica. Investigators were now almost certain that David Brooks was connected to her disappearance in some way. His younger brother Joseph, who was present during part of the search of the property, also behaved in a manner agents found notable. But there was a problem. Despite the photograph, despite the cadaver dog alert, despite every behavioral indicator, nothing found on Brooks's property constituted sufficient legal grounds for an arrest. On September 27th, 17 days after Jessica disappeared, a woman was driving along a road near the river, the same area where her father had searched in the early days. She noticed something at the base of a tree just off the road. She stopped. She walked toward it. She realized it was a body. She called 911. FBI agents arrived and confirmed it. A young woman, missing several fingers and limbs. A rope with traces of red and silver paint tied around her legs. Portions of her clothing were absent. Advanced decomposition made immediate visual identification impossible. An officer went to the Dish home. Jessica's father could not bring himself to go to the scene. Her mother went. She looked at the body. She could not identify her at first. Then she saw a small butterfly tattoo, identical to her daughter's, in the same location. Medical examiners later confirmed the identity and established cause of death as strangulation. The injuries to the body's extremities had occurred after death, but the finding that devastated the family most was the estimated timeline. Jessica had been alive for approximately 3 days after her disappearance. The police had had those 3 days. They had done nothing. After Jessica's body was found, the FBI brought David Brooks back in for questioning. In the initial conversation after her disappearance, he had told investigators he had seen Jessica near her house on the morning she vanished. Now he contradicted himself entirely, saying he had not seen her that day at all, that he had been home in bed with his wife. When his wife was questioned separately, her account did not align with his. Agents pressed him. They asked what he would do if his fingerprints were found on the victim. Brooks's response, that he supposed in that case he would have to confess to everything, alarmed investigators. He subsequently failed a polygraph examination. He was arrested, and the case moved toward trial. During the preparation period, investigators found additional circumstantial evidence. In Brooks's vehicle, they discovered a rope similar to the one that had been tied around Jessica's legs. No DNA was recovered from it. The trial began in January 2003. The defense maintained that the prosecution had no meaningful direct evidence against their client. That argument was not wrong. And then the investigation's failures compounded into something irreversible. When Jessica's missing limbs had been found near the body during the recovery, they had been placed in labeled containers handed to local police. The containers were labeled to be refrigerated. They were left at room temperature. The decomposition that resulted destroyed whatever physical evidence they might have contained. The jury could not reach a unanimous verdict. David Brooks walked free. Under state law, he could only face trial again on this charge if new evidence emerged. For Jessica's family, this was the final failure in a chain of failures that had begun the morning the sheriff sent them home. Stay with this, because what happens next involves a detective who joins this case 13 years after Jessica's death and finds something in an unexamined box of files that should have solved this case in 2002. Subscribe to Unresolved Years Mysteries so you don't miss how this ends. In 2012, a detective named Lynn Hunt joined the local police department. She was assigned to cold cases. Jessica Dish's murder was among them. What Hunt found when she reviewed the case file left her stunned. The documentation was riddled with errors. Conversations with key individuals were absent from records. Evidence had not been properly cataloged or stored. The handling of the case from 1999 forward had been so deficient that she effectively had to rebuild the investigation from nothing 13 years after the crime. Her first step was to speak with Jessica's family. One of her brothers, now an adult, gave her a box of items that had been in Jessica's car on the morning she disappeared. The police had returned these to the family years earlier. Hunt was again shocked. The items had not been stored under proper evidentiary protocols. She went through everything anyway, methodically, hoping something had been overlooked. She found Brooks's medical evaluation report in the files. It noted an IQ of 61. Hunt sat with that information carefully. Given that cognitive profile, many of Brooks's responses during interrogation, the strange comments, the behavioral inconsistencies, could be explained by confusion and limited comprehension rather than consciousness of guilt. She began to consider whether Brooks had been correctly identified as the primary suspect at all. She expanded the scope of her review. She began researching every person who had been near Jessica's life and the investigation, looking for anything that hadn't been properly examined. She continued this work for 2 years. In September 2014, nearly 15 years after Jessica's death, a colleague from another department contacted Hunt with an unusual lead. An inmate at a Kentucky state prison claimed to know who had killed Jessica Dish. Hunt approached this with measured caution. Prison informants represent a complicated category of witness. Motivations vary, and fabricated accounts are common. But she understood that she could not evaluate the lead without going to hear it. She went to the prison. The informant described a situation that had developed when he shared a cell with another man convicted of child-related crimes. On the basis of that shared experience, the two had spoken openly with each other. The cellmate had eventually told him, in detail, about the murder of Jessica Dish. And then the informant gave Hunt a name. Stanley Dish, Jessica's uncle, her father's own brother. According to what Stanley had told the informant, he had abused Jessica for years while living in the family home, controlling her silence through threats. When Jessica began her first relationship with the boyfriend in the spring of 1999, Stanley became afraid. He believed she would eventually tell the young man what had been happening. He decided to act before that could happen. On the morning of September 10, 1999, Stanley arrived at the Dish home when Jessica was alone. She was outside, loading her belongings into her car for school. He confronted her and demanded she end the relationship. She refused and told him that if he didn't leave her alone, she would expose him. He threatened her. She reached into the car for her phone and began dialing. He grabbed at her. She pulled free and ran inside the house. He followed her to her room, overpowered her, restrained her with bedsheets, and took her to an abandoned structure not far from where her body would eventually be found. He kept her there for several days. Then he killed her. He moved her body to a location near the road and buried the sheets in the ground beneath the shed. He removed portions of her body post-mortem to make the crime scene appear consistent with the work of criminal organizations operating in the area. Hunt listened to every detail. And then the informant mentioned something that confirmed for her that this account was not fabricated. He described the missing limbs. He described the burial of the bedsheets. Those were details that had never been made public. They existed only in case files and in the knowledge of those closest to the investigation. No one constructing a false account would have access to them. Hunt asked about the shoe. The informant said Stanley had buried one of Jessica's shoes beneath a broken tree near the shed. Hunt needed to verify what she had been told before acting on it. She was short on personnel. The department didn't have the staff to support a formal search operation. She reached out to Jessica's brother, now an adult, and a small group of family members who agreed to help. She did not tell them what she suspected about Stanley. The first day of searching was difficult. They dug in areas consistent with the informant's description of the shed's location. Rain made the work harder. Nothing was found. The next day, Hunt and Jessica's brother returned. On the drive out, he pointed to an old barn alongside the road. They went in. They began digging. Almost immediately, their tools found something. Fabric, buried beneath the surface. A bedsheet. Hunt collected it and went directly to the Dish family home. 15 years after Jessica disappeared, her parents had not changed her room. It remained exactly as it was on the morning she vanished. The bed made, her belongings in place, her remaining bedding stored where it had always been. Hunt compared the sheet she had dug up to what remained. The pattern matched. It was part of Jessica's bedding. The recovered sheet was absent from the bed. Stanley Dish was arrested. Jessica's father could not initially accept what he was being told. His brother, the man who had been at his side from the first moment, who had helped lead the early searches, who had been in the car with him when they combed the area near the river, who had felt suddenly ill during one of those searches and asked to be driven home, was the person who had killed his daughter. That moment on the search, when Stanley had become unwell and they had turned back, they had been within a few hundred yards of the barn where Jessica was being held. She may still have been alive. Stanley had guided them away from her. Hunt, continuing her investigation ahead of trial, discovered something that added yet another layer to the case's failures. In an unexamined box of old documents, she found a letter dated June 26, 2002. Another informant had written to the police department. The letter contained the same account, the same details, the same name, the same description of the hidden bedsheets that Hunt had heard from the prison informant 12 years later. In 2002, Stanley had been incarcerated on an assault charge. He had told his cellmate what he had done to Jessica. That cellmate, a police informant, had written it all down and sent the letter to the department handling the case. The police had received the letter. They had ignored it. They had been focused on Brooks, and they had not followed the information in front of them. Jessica's case could have been solved in 2002. The trial began in 2015. Stanley declared his innocence. Jessica's parents sat in the courtroom and could barely look at the man who had been part of their family for decades. They were also carrying the knowledge that he had never once offered them an explanation, an acknowledgement, or any information about where their daughter had been, what she had experienced, or why he had done what he did. Prosecutors assessed the evidence carefully. Physical proof was limited: the bed sheet, the informant accounts, the behavioral evidence. Direct forensic evidence linking Stanley to the murder did not exist in the way it might have if the investigation had been conducted properly from the start. The charges involving the other women in the family, whose accounts established a pattern of predatory behavior spanning decades, would require each of them to testify in detail. The prosecution offered a plea agreement. In exchange for a guilty plea covering both the murder of Jessica and the assaults on other family members, the death penalty would be taken off the table. Stanley accepted. He pleaded guilty. Under the terms of the agreement, he was not required to provide any specific details about the crimes. He received a 20-year sentence with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Given his age at sentencing 56, he could potentially be released at 71. Jessica's parents were not given the full account of what happened to their daughter. The plea deal had taken that away from them. Jessica's father made a statement after sentencing. If his brother was ever released, he said, he would be waiting. In 2019, Stanley gave his first public interview from prison. He claimed he had not killed Jessica. He said he had been at work that morning. The claim was unverifiable after 20 years. He could not explain how two separate informants, in different institutions years apart, had independently provided the same account, including specific details about the bedsheets and the body that had never been made public. As for David Brooks, investigators did not entirely rule out that he may have played some minor role in the aftermath of the crime. Stanley knew him. Given Brooks's significantly limited cognitive capacity, it was possible that Stanley had enlisted his help in disposing of evidence without Brooks fully understanding what had happened. The photo of Jessica found in one of Brooks's outbuildings may have been placed there deliberately. The clothing burned on his property may have been given to him by Stanley. The full picture of Brooks's involvement was never established. He died in 2021 from heart failure. Whatever he knew went with him. The question of what Jessica's younger brother heard on the third morning, the cry that brought his father running outside with a shotgun, the moment when Stanley arrived at the house at the same time, remains unresolved. The barn where Jessica was held was a few miles away. She may have still been alive when that sound was heard. What the sound was, no one can say with certainty. But the timing of Stanley's arrival that morning, coinciding with the moment her brother came running inside, is a detail that sits uneasily in the record. Jessica Dish had tried to dial 911 in the seconds she had. She nearly made it. She was 17 years old. She was saving for a car she had already earned. She was planning for college. She was in her first relationship. She had everything ahead of her. The person who took all of that from her was not a stranger. He was someone she had known her entire life, someone her family trusted without question, someone who stood at her father's side in the early searches and drove him away from finding her while she was still alive. Detective Lynn Hunt, who joined the department 13 years after the crime, opened a box of files no one had looked at and found a letter from 2002 that should have ended this case a decade earlier, brought the truth forward with nothing more than persistence, precision, and the refusal to accept that a case being cold meant it was closed. Justice, when it came, was delayed by 15 years of compounding failures. It came through a plea deal that gave the family answers without giving them the full truth. Kirsten was never given back the years that were taken from her, but her name was finally attached to the truth. Jessica Dish deserves to be remembered as more than a cold case that finally got solved. She was a real person with a real future that was taken from her by someone her family trusted. If this episode gave you something, subscribe to Unresolved Years Mysteries and share this story. Every person who knows her name carries it forward.